Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, my loves, my lords, my ladies, my peasants. Welcome back to the Sweet Nothings podcast, or welcome if it's your first time. If it has been unclear as until now, this is your home of relaxed, funny, and informative chats all about the love of eating. We'll talk about the latest food trends, controversial opinions, and all things edible. My name is Kelly. I'm the baker, writer, person behind Maverick Baking and Sweet Nothings. It's a pleasure to meet you or to re-meet you if it's been a little while. Today, I want to talk about food rules and whether or not, or when, or why, or if they should ever be broken. But first, as always, we're going to touch upon some of the fun, the nonsense, the ridiculousness that's been going on in the world of food in the month of January, because thank God it is finally, after 86 weeks, over. So a couple of new products have been launched in the UK this January, which is not anything new, but some of them are interesting in that they're not just like diet and weight loss products or protein products, which is nice to see. One, for example, is that Divine, the chocolate company, who are a bean to bar company, great ethics, that you can find in supermarkets and isn't kind of like hugely out of budget, which some ethical chocolate can be, have launched 3 new bars inspired by desserts. There's a Bakewell tart inspired bar, a tiramisu inspired bar, and also a cheesecake, like a lemon cheesecake inspired one. I don't think I'll be able to get my hands on these in Italy, or if not, I'll have to have a little kind of search for them online, but they look really, really good. And I've always been very impressed by Divine Chocolate whenever I've had it. So interested to see the kind of general consensus on those. A slightly bizarre one from January is that Kellogg's, for what seems to be amazingly the first time, have released chocolate cornflakes. Now, you might think I'm out of my mind for saying that because I thought I was out of my mind while I was reading it. But this seems to be the first time that they've done just chocolate cornflakes. Now, I'm not talking about, Frosties. I'm not talking about your Cocoa Pops or any of your other kind of chocolate cereal, but under the like iconic cornflakes brand, the one with the big Kellogg's rooster. For the first time, like the first time, they've decided to do this in 2024. A little bit mad. Like, is that just me, or does it seem like they're about 40 to 50 years late in launching that? Like, all of the good chocolate breakfast cereals I thought were born, in the 80s. The more ridiculous, hyper sugary ones perhaps in the 90s, but launching chocolate cornflakes in 2024, we should be on to like, yuzu salted caramel cornflakes by this point, not just chocolate. They even set up like a pop-up shop thing in some cities to promote these things. And why? What? The marketing just seems like it's been just a completely off brand. A pop-up shop for a bowl of Kellogg's cornflakes that are chocolatey for the first time, like in the city centre of Manchester. What's going on? I don't know. Slightly less exciting, slightly more predictable. For example, McDonald's have launched for Valentine's Day a ruby chocolate Kit Kat McFlurry. Lot going on there. Ruby chocolate being the pink, slightly berried flavored chocolate that was very, very hyped up about 6 to 8 years ago. Like, it's nothing new. It's a predictable kind of Valentine's Day edition because it's pink and it's cute and the girlies will enjoy it. Why they've decided to do like a Kit Kat Ruby chocolate one, I don't know. We reviewed the Ruby chocolate Kit Kat back when I had almost like a skinhead haircut. So you can see it's been a little while since it was trending. using my hair as a Of course, that doesn't apply to audio listeners, my apologies, but you can see from any picture on Instagram or on YouTube how long it's been since something was in fashion in terms of confectionery based on the length of my hair and the laziness of it. Something I didn't expect, though, again, pretty on brand for him, is that Rod Stewart has a whiskey brand. Now, I didn't know this, but it's now kind of being launched in supermarkets for the first time on a kind of wider scale. It's called Wolfie's. It's a blended Scotch whiskey, so you're not talking of the highest, single malt quality. I'm guessing it's supposed to be a kind of entry level thing. Yeah, I don't know, that's there. If you're a fan, if you're a Scot and you want to try a new, relatively budget-friendly whiskey, I'm not big into whiskey, so I'll be missing out on it, but didn't know it was a thing, and now I do. And now you do too. And moving on from kind of the products that have been launched or grown in January is the only real kind of viral food trend that I've come across this month being snow cream. Thanks to the slightly, I mean, I'm about to say slightly insane, but I think it might also just be relatively normal at this point for Canadians. The insane amounts of snow and insanely low temperatures that were going on in Canada at the start of in the middle of January. You're talking like minus 30 something degrees. The coldest I've ever physically experienced was about minus 21 in Scotland, and there's a reason I'm in Italy now. Do you know what I mean? So my condolences for that, first of all. But snow cream, which is apparently a thing, this isn't like a new thing, it's just that it's been kind of widespread online thanks to TikTok, etc. now for the first time, is basically people going out to scoop up a cup of actual snow, fresh from like your own garden or your own doorstep, not just from like the city centre of Toronto that you found on the pavement, and then mixing that snow with condensed milk and then eating it like it's a kind of frozen dessert. Now, would it pass any kind of food hygiene check? Probably not. Considering the damage we've done to the planet, do we know what the hell is in rainwater? Probably not. Would I taste it regardless? Yeah. It's not something that I would have ever considered. People are certainly creative, but apparently it's been a thing for a while in really cold climates. I can imagine it's very refreshing, but would I want to be eating something cold and refreshing when it's minus 30 something degrees outside? I don't know. It's a kind of cute idea. I can imagine it's a great one to do with kids if they're inside and bored out of their minds because it's snowing. Though, again, these days, being inside and bored out of your mind on a snow day probably isn't possible, but thanks to technology. But, you get the gist. But other than that, I haven't really seen too much in terms of excitement with new products or new food trends. Do let me know if I've missed anything out, but those were the main things that popped up on my radar over the past, I was going to say 30 days, but January, as we know, feels like a lot longer. And I now want to move on to food rules. What do I mean by this? I don't mean in the sense of disordered eating, though some people have perceived it that way, and we're going to talk about that anyway. I mean food rules more in terms of kind of culinary musts, the kind of rules you must obey when cooking, when eating, the kind of things you have to follow if you don't want people to look at you funny when you're cooking or eating. You know what I mean? But also that's extended because obviously, much like myself, a lot of my listeners, a lot of my Instagram followers who I ask these questions to have had a history or even a present with disordered eating. There's elements of that and kind of rules around eating and what you should or shouldn't do when it comes to, your health and your weight management, etc. too. So we're going to touch on those too because food rules being perceived that way was interesting enough. What brought this to mind was an evening last week in which my other half and I were debating about chopping a carrot. Now, truly, life is very thrilling in our house, as you can imagine. He was preparing what is known in Italian as a soffritto to make a sauce of some kind. I now can't even remember what the sauce was because this was clearly the all-consuming part of the conversation. So he had chopped an onion, he had chopped celery, and he had chopped carrots into these tiny equal pieces that are then cooked in olive oil until, as we then debated upon, a specific shade of golden brown, if they have to be, not burnt, browned, blah, blah, blah. And I was telling him that he could speed up the whole process, mostly because I was hungry and impatient, which is my usual state of being anyway, that he could speed up the process, at least for the carrot, by using a box grater, because we had one sat right there. He'd already used it for some cheese for something else. So I said to him, if you like, while you're finishing chopping the celery, I can just grate the carrot into the pan, bang. and he was horrified. I should point out he's Italian, so it's very easy to horrify Italians in the kitchen, as we all know. Uh, and he couldn't believe the suggestion. He began kind of asking, why would you do that? Why would you grate it? And I'm like, because it's faster. Like, you don't need to, there's not a head chef who's going to walk in and slap you on the wrist or threaten you at knife point because you haven't chopped a perfect brunoise of carrots, In a professional kitchen, perhaps, that's his business. But when you're at home, girly pop, let's use the shortcut. And he wasn't into it. It wasn't, anything he'd ever considered or anything he'd ever heard of before. And I said, well, why do you think we have graters? There was a reason that certain products were invented. We invented the fork to make eating easier and cleaner. We invented the grater so that we didn't have to chop, things like cheese or butter into these tiny, 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 tiny pieces so that we could save time, save the likelihood of slicing the top of our finger off, depending on what kind of grater you're using and how careless you are with it, because it can happen. To do these things quickly and efficiently. So why not do it with a carrot? I told him I've done it all the time when it comes to a sofrito or into a salad. He agreed it was appropriate for a salad, but not for cooking, because that's not how it's done. Now, Italian traditions in the kitchen are there for a reason. It's one of the best, if not the best cuisine in the world. I get it. However, it made me absolutely spiral into thinking about food rules that we can and can't break, things that we can and can't do, and why can we or can't we do them? Do you know what I mean? So, from what I've been thinking about and from what I've read from kind of your responses and things like that, there are things that work for our specific needs or, sorry, I think I just punched the microphone by accident there. Sorry, headphone users. There are things that work for our palate or for our personal needs. I mean, personal as in specifically the individual, not even based on the family, because people are picky. There are things that work for our palate that shouldn't be brought forward into food history, for example. A classic, while we're in the process of insulting Italians, vi voglio bene, ma lo devo dire. There's a reason why pineapple on pizza is so controversial. For some people, it genuinely tastes great because they want that lovely salty cheese, that lovely kind of savory umami ham usually, or prosciutto cotto, whatever it would be, on the pizza with the pineapple, which is sweet and juicy. They like it. It tastes good to them. There are things like that taste good to some people that taste and feel absolutely atrocious to others. I will give you an extremely personal, specific, and somewhat revolting example of this. I think I may have brought this up on a previous episode when we were talking about the weirdest things we've ever eaten. One of the things I used to love as a kid, and honestly, if it wouldn't raise too many eyebrows among the people I live with, etc., one of the things I used to eat was, those Muller Corner yogurts, the vanilla ones. At least in the UK, we have these ones that are vanilla flavored, the actual yogurt, and it has tiny little biscuit balls that are covered in white milk and dark chocolate. Very pretty. Would still eat them now. Delicious. Now, the vanilla yogurt is very kind of runny. It's not a kind of thick, natural or Greek yogurt. It's a very runny kids yogurt, something to give a kid as dessert or breakfast or whatever you like. Now, I used to eat these every single morning. I still would. And I used to dip into this because clearly I had some kind of calcium deficiency as a child. Small chunks of extra mature cheddar. And then eat it. Now, I know this is hideous. I know it looks awful. It has a seriously questionable mouthfeel, and I know most people would probably gag at the concept. To me, it was absolutely perfect. It was salty and punchy and acidic, and then had that lovely kind of creamy sweetness. Cheese and vanilla, hear me out, already goes well together anyway. Now, would I ever present this to another person to eat? No. Not, and if I do, call someone to take me away. But I loved it, and I probably would still eat it now. I love salty and sweet together, as many of us do, and I especially love cheese with sweet things. Like if there's a cheese board and there's jam there, I'm skipping the crackers, whatever you're trying to make me feel elegant by pairing with it. I'm just putting the jam or the chutney straight on the cheese and putting it into my mouth. I want to be overwhelmed in terms of palate. Do you know what I mean? I love that. That's a food rule that no one's made yet, but should be made. Do you know what I mean? That's a pairing that does, it's not a thing. Cheese and yogurt don't go together for a reason in that context. However, I will put them together. I think there are also times when new additions to perhaps a traditional recipe, seeing as we're relatively staying on the Italian topic here, new additions, new ingredients, new techniques may make things easier because not everyone's a good cook, not everyone's experienced, and not all of us can afford to waste ingredients fecking something up when we're trying to feed ourselves or feed people or just not cry. You know, there are days like that. And there are also kind of new additions and new things you can do to cheat a little bit and make something even richer in flavor, you know? But in perhaps a somewhat kind of overindulgent way. Think, for example, double cream in a carbonara. Now, does it serve a scientific purpose? Yes, it means that you are then able to heat the egg in the carbonara all the way through to make sure that it's cooked. Because some people do have a bit of a thing with the fact that the egg in a carbonara isn't technically all the way cooked through as it should be to meet perfect hygiene standards all the time, though that gets rid immediately of the creaminess and it can often turn it into a very ugly bacon scrambled egg with some spaghetti thrown in looking thing. Similarly, it means that it's always going to be nice and emulsified so that even if it is a little bit overcooked, it's all going to stay together. You're going to have the right amount of sauce no matter what, because that's what the cream does. You can add or take away more based on what you need. And it also undoubtedly is going to make the thing taste even better because double cream is delicious. It's like 40 to 50% fat. Of course our palate's going to love it. Of course your cooking's going to taste better even if you forget a bit of salt or if you don't have the perfect quality guanciale or whatever it is that you're cooking with. That's an easy example. And it's one that I think many people could understand, but also not condone. You know, I wouldn't do it personally, but I completely understand why people would do it. So it begs the question, is it ever okay to break food rules, whatever they may be, however you perceive the concept of a food rule? And let's talk about it. I asked you guys on Instagram what you think about this. Are there any rules that you break, any that should be broken, any that you wish people would break and just throw out the window? And some of the responses I completely agree with. Some of them I think you're all just as insane as I am on a slightly different level, which I'm a huge fan of. The very, very, very first response I got, which just warmed my heart to my question, what food rules do you think should be broken, was anything that makes Italians clutch their pearls. I would drop this mic if it wasn't expensive, because that's perfect. In the context of this podcast and just in general, I love that as a response. But other people, for example, responded, there was a couple of people responded along the lines of only eating certain foods at breakfast time or only eating what are considered breakfast foods at breakfast time. Now, not every country has this concept, I must say. Americans, for example, while they don't necessarily have to stick to a sweet breakfast or to a savory breakfast, that depends on your taste. You might be a cereal person, a pancakes person. You might be the kind of person who wants eggs and bacon. You couldn't fathom the idea of a sugary breakfast. There's definitely a set kind of amount of things that are normal for breakfast. In the US, for example, it wouldn't be normal to eat rice at breakfast time, really, or to eat, I don't know, noodles at breakfast time, to have a cheeseburger at breakfast time. There are things that just don't really sound right. The same with British people. Our traditional full English breakfast is very, very heavy and would drive Southern Europeans to tears at the thought of having to eat that ever, let alone first thing in the morning. There are countries in the Mediterranean, for example, much like Italy and Spain, where breakfast is a much lighter kind of affair. Italians specifically go mad for pastries and tiny coffees. Um, so that contrasts hugely with the fact that there are, African and Asian countries who just eat any food at breakfast time, much like, they would at lunch or at dinner time, which makes a lot of sense, really. I don't know if ours is a kind of fallout from consumerist marketing, etc., that we can only have certain products and certain things at certain times. That's a whole separate podcast discussion, though, so let's leave that one aside for now. But I do agree with that. Eat whatever you like at breakfast. There's people back home who think I'm insane for eating chocolate regularly for breakfast, but in Italy it's considered fairly normal. Another rule that someone would like to break is washing chicken. Now, I have never actually seen this in real life. I've heard that people do this, and I've since looked into why people do this, and it seems to be the fact that they consider the chicken to be unsafe and unhygienic until rinsed with water, like warm or cold water. I think most people trained in food hygiene would know that that's not really the best idea. Both because it's not going to get rid of the harmful bacteria on the chicken. Most of the harmful bacteria that would be on the chicken, while it's still, fresh and safe to cook and eat, is killed while cooking. It's killed by high temperatures. That's why we cook chicken all the way through in a way that's different to what we would do with a steak. You're not going to remove it with water. I don't really know where that came from. Also, the idea of washing a chicken breast and all of the kind of, raw chicken juices going all over the sink is just kind of no. If you do it, you do you. As long as you thoroughly wipe down your surfaces in your sink afterwards, I'm not going to stop you. But yeah, that feels like a counterintuitive use of your time before cooking. Someone a little bit more controversially said that they would like to break the rule of rinsing rice now. There are people who do this and people who don't. I believe the people who cook rice the best are the ones who rinse the rice. But I would also stay on side with the people who don't rinse their rice, because some of us come from places with absolutely zero food culture. No one ever taught us that we were supposed to rinse rice. I began washing my rice for the first time probably at the age of 25. Does it make a difference to the finished product? I have to say yes. It has a different texture when you wash it versus when you don't wash it, because you're getting rid of, some starches and things like that. Some people believe it's also good for hygiene reasons. I guess that can depend on where you get your rice from, though. Though I have to say, there have been times when I've either forgotten or haven't been bothered to rinse the rice, and it hasn't ruined a meal by any stretch of the imagination. So again, I feel like that's a you do you kind of answer. A couple of people were very insistent on not understanding kind of the dessert after dinner or the sweet after savory mentality. And I have to say, I kind of agree with this. Having sweet and savory together does work, can work, even in my disgusting contexts. Do I want it all the time, though? No. The dessert afterwards, I think, comes for a number of reasons. I enjoy having the dessert afterwards because dessert to me, sweet things to me, are more enjoyable and more kind of satisfying for the soul than salty foods are a lot of the time. That's just me. It's just my preferences. Therefore, having it last is nice, because that's the kind of lingering memory, the lingering flavor, the lingering feeling you have after the meal. And also, usually after something salty, I want a little something sweet, but not the other way around, Also, I think with dessert, if a lot of us eat it first, we wouldn't be particularly well nourished, because desserts are often, not filled with vegetables or nutritionally balanced in the same way that kind of savory meals are. Also, if you were to eat a big thing of chocolate or something filled with a lot of sugar or cream or something like that, it can also kind of not taint your palate necessarily, but can kind of cover up what would have allowed you to taste more delicate flavors afterwards. If you were to eat a chocolate fondant, one of those like chocolate lava cakes, and then eat a salad, of course the salad's going to taste terrible. You've literally conditioned your mouth to something full of delicious, bold flavors and saturated fats. That's the point. So I can't say I agree with breaking that one. I understand the purpose of the dessert afterwards, but I'm not going to stop you again. Much along the kind of same lines as me grating the carrot, which I still do and will continue to do in place of chopping it into tiny pieces, because chopping an onion is fine, it takes seconds. Chopping a carrot into tiny pieces is just a ball ache, let's be serious. And someone else agreed. Someone else said, I can't be bothered with meticulous, precise chopping when I'm cooking for myself or for the family. In a restaurant, yes, it makes sense. You don't want to waste product. You want to make sure you have a kind of consistent output. At home, who cares? As long as everything cooks at roughly the same time and you like the way it feels and tastes in your mouth, who cares? Someone says they don't understand the kind of thing that everyone has with soggy cereal. You know, that people pour the milk on or have the milk and the cereal in a certain way, in a certain order, in a certain fashion to ensure that it maintains the crispness as much as possible. But they're saying they don't understand that because they actually quite like soggy cereal. Now, I don't entirely disagree with this either. I don't like all forms of cereal soggy. For example, I think soggy cornflakes or soggy Frosties, for example, or even soggy like Cocoa Pops is kind of gross. But certain things like Cheerios or like a chunky granola, I kind of agree. I kind of like when it turns a little bit mushy and kind of soaks up the milk a little bit. I don't dislike it. Plus, it kind of parts the sweetness into the milk and everything gets all kind of nice and mingled together. I'm probably making some people gag at the thought, but I kind of agree with this as a food breaking rule. People are too particular about cereal. One that came up 3 times from both Brits and Italians was wanting to break the very strong Italian rule of not mixing fish, like a fish pasta dish, with cheese. So, for example, not kind of grating a generous amount of grana padano or parmesan or pecorino over the top of a fish or seafood based pasta. I've never agreed with this. The reasoning makes sense. Fish is very, very delicate. Seafood can have a very delicate flavor. If you cover it with something creamy and salty, it's gonna shrink. It's gonna get lost. Some of us just really like cheese, okay? And some of us have such a palate for cheese that it doesn't necessarily cover everything. I can have cheese with things and totally appreciate it because I eat cheese every single day. And you know, obviously there are times when you wouldn't want cheddar and tuna together, or you wouldn't want parmesan with prawns necessarily, but there are times when it really, really, really does go together. Or, you know, instead of a little bit of extra salt in the dish, you just want a little bit of grated strong cheese over the top, you know? There are definitely examples of seeing seafood and cheese together if it's a slightly more creamy cheese. So it's not as kind of hard a rule as I think we're made to believe it is. But yeah, I'm completely with you on breaking that one. Someone was very strong about their feelings on not being allowed to put ice in wine. It's February, so I don't have strong feelings about this at this particular moment. However, if I was filming this in June, I would be agreeing with you wholeheartedly. Does it look good? No. Ice and red wine particularly looks absolutely unhinged. Ice and white wine is not only delicious and refreshing, it makes sense. Again, I understand the why not. I understand that winemaking countries from all over the world will be cringing at the thought, but you know, because it waters down the wine and it gets rid of the flavors and it makes everything too cold. If it's cheap wine and you're at home and it's hot, I don't see any reason why not to. I feel the same way about beer, which again would make people cringe, but the thought of having ice and beer on a on a super, super hot day when you're at home, why not? Why not? You know, we put ice in mixed drinks with absolutely no problem whatsoever. And yes, it waters them down too. But I completely agree with this. Personally, I wouldn't do it with red wine because I like red wine at room temperature. But yeah, ice and white wine, just in the same way that you would put it in a Spritz Bianco or a Spritz Aperol. Absolutely, I'm with you there. Again, clearly I have a lot of followers who have strong opinions about Italian food rules, but someone says they don't understand the kind of not being normal to drink a cappuccino after 11 o'clock in the morning. Now, this is not something that will get you heinously judged. It's not the norm, I'll put it that way, but it's also not as kind of big a deal. It's not as deep as the, you know, I moved to Italy TikTok girlies would make you think. I order and make cappuccinos after 11 o'clock. It's not that weird. Whether it's, to drink in a bar or to take away, it's more the issue with the milk rather than the specific kind of coffee or the fact you're drinking coffee, full stop. Milk for Italians is a super, super specifically breakfast food. Whether you're having a glass of cold or warm milk to have your biscuits with, or whether you're having a bowl of milk and adding cereal to it, don't get me started, or whether you're having a cappuccino and dipping biscuits into that, or having a little cake with that, milk is the issue, not so much a cappuccino specifically. It's also the same reason that like cafe latte isn't a big deal in Italy, because people just aren't really interested. It's a breakfast food. So the thought of someone having it after lunch or with lunch or, at say 4 or 5 p.m., they don't get it. I, on the other hand, being from an absolute cultural wasteland and somewhere that's always cold, the thought of a cappuccino in the afternoon is absolutely lovely because like it's warm and it's comforting and it's delicious. I also love an espresso in the afternoon, but there's times I just want something milky. Do you know what I mean? That lasts a bit longer. Sometimes I want to walk around with a coffee cup in my hand, and I'm not going to do that with an espresso cup. It's pointless. So yes, I agree with this. It's not as big a deal as you think it is in any part of Italy from my experience. Do it. Whether it's for you or to piss someone off, do it. There were a couple of people saying that they make additions to like traditional recipes for ragu, for example. Now, this I actually don't think is that controversial because ragu is something that changes family to family, let alone region to region. There are people who put wine in it. There's people who say you shouldn't put wine in it. There's people who add milk. There's some who think that's disgusting. Some put in loads of tomatoes, some hardly any. Some mix in sausage meat, some don't. It's all delicious. It's ragu, it's slow cooked meat and vegetables and usually some alcohol. It's gorgeous. The body craves more every time it tastes it. I had a message from an Italian girl who adds fish sauce, like the Asian seasoning, to ragu because that has a kind of savouriness. And I don't hate the idea. For example, I add Worcestershire sauce to ragu. Completely inauthentic and non-traditional. But I think Worcestershire sauce makes everything taste better because it's got that kind of deeply savoury umami flavour that soy sauce and fish sauce, etc. have that you can't really get from anything else. So sometimes it just adds an extra little kick of flavour. Why not? Moving on from the kind of specific roasting of Italians, because I'm going a bit too hard on this, to what people believe are rules around kind of what you can and can't do in terms of eating, not just cooking. For example, I had a couple of messages related to double carbs, which is a kind of thing that's quite horrifying to some people who are scared of food or who don't have a good relationship with food, which I have been in past, so I understand it. For example, it's not considered okay to have pasta and to have bread with it. Or it's not considered okay to have a rice-based dish and to also have bread or to also have potatoes. Now, almost every cuisine ever, especially the ones that have kind of backgrounds in poverty and using whatever you have, would hugely disagree with this. I think this is a very, very, very modern diet culture linked food rule. It doesn't really have any particularly good basis. Nutritionally speaking, if you're eating only the double carbs, then yes, your blood sugar is going to spike and you're going to feel terrible after like an hour. But most of the time, the double carbs would be, for example, if you were having a potato or vegetable-based curry with rice, it's going to fill you up and it's going to be relatively balanced for your glucose levels and it's going to be delicious. Similarly, if you have a gorgeous bowl of pasta and there's a big load of sauce sitting on the bottom of the bowl, a spoon will never pick that up. Feel free to do it with your tongue, but a restaurant's not going to be particularly impressed by that. Neither is the kitchen porter who's going to have to wash it for you. Use some bread. It's perfect. There are things that absolutely need to have double carbs. Should you have it all the time every day? Probably not, unless you're working an extremely manual job or you're super active. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. A lot of the time it actually makes sense. Carbs are also usually the kind of cheapest part of any meal, so why limit yourself? On the subject of carbs, someone also brought up the whole thing of not eating carbohydrates in the evening. Again, this I think can either be based in culture, as in like where you're actually from, and also in terms of the diet culture that seeps into our brains and rots them. There are opinions that eating carbohydrates in the evening can kind of slow your digestion down, both ruining your rest a little bit and also not allowing your body to properly put the energy to good use. There are people who can test it all the time. And more importantly than that, almost every single human being has a completely different activity level, metabolic rate and sleep schedule, so it's not the most reliable rule to live by in the first place. If I've just worked a 6 hour evening shift and I come home, I don't want a chicken breast and broccoli. I want crackers, I want some bread, I want something for a reason. My body wants them, my body needs them. If you feel better not having it, then don't have it. There are some people who don't have the chance to eat a big meal during the day, so they like a big meal at night. It's comforting, it's filling, it's nourishing, it's relaxing a lot of the time too. This I've seen arguments for and arguments against. You do you. And the last one, which I thought was a very important one that I would also like to break, personally speaking, is the only eating at certain times. Now, this plays into very much the idea of intuitive eating, which I've spoken about in a previous episode of the podcast before, and a couple of times on my YouTube channel too. Only eating at specific times or at acceptable times is something we often have to do for work, for family commitments, for sometimes for taking medicine at particular intervals, things like that. But if you're someone who has a bit of flexibility or could afford a bit more flexibility, I would always recommend it. There's nothing worse than having to wait until a certain time to eat when you're hungry, or on the flip side, knowing that you can only eat at 12 o'clock when you're not hungry at 12 o'clock. You don't get hungry until 2 o'clock. And it sounds very minor, but on the daily, it can really impact how you feel about food, both the fact that you may get too excited and fixated on food if you feel like you're being restricted, or you may begin to kind of have feelings of rejection towards food if you're being made to eat at times when you don't want it and you don't need it. There are some people who absolutely love breakfast. I'm one of those people. And there's some who can't stand it. They shouldn't be made to eat breakfast. I, for example, am always insatiably hungry first thing in the morning and have quite a small appetite when it comes to dinner time. A lot of people are completely different to that. Let them be. If you're someone who has a bit of flexibility in choosing when to eat, please do it. Don't, just abide by what normal people think is lunchtime or dinner time or snack time, yada, yada, yada. If you're hungry, it's probably because you need to eat or drink something. Let's call it as basic as that. So overall, I think, there are kind of three ways in which I think it's okay to break food rules, whether it comes to cooking or eating, based on all of this meticulous research we've done. The first being convenience, because girls and boys, we live ridiculous lifestyles nowadays compared to what our ancestors lived. And we need convenience. Most of us are working more than we should be, earning less than we should be. We sometimes need to take shortcuts. For example, a super, super popular one at the moment and for the past few years has been the air fryer. Why turn on an oven that takes up all this space, that takes up all this time, all this energy, that you're paying for as well, when you could use an air fryer, which will do it in half the time? If I have to turn on and preheat an oven for 15 to 20 minutes before putting something to cook in for 30, when my air fryer could do the whole thing in half that time, it makes sense. I don't even have an air fryer, but there are people who have them for that very reason. Plus, if there's only one or two of you eating, why on earth would you need to use an oven? Yes, it's no, means of culinary excellence, but it's convenient and it produces a very similar result. So why not? Budget is also another very, very, very important factor. Certain pricey ingredients, especially such as meat and cheese these days, can be substituted, let's be real. We would all love to buy the most artisanal guanciale to make the carbonara with. Sometimes we can't find it. Sometimes we can't afford it. You can use pancetta. Will it taste different? Yeah. Will you get the gist of that kind of lovely, savory, salty pork flavor? Yeah. Similarly, you can swap grana padano for parmesan. No one's going to die. And it's like half the price, let's be real. And, also certain cooking times can be reduced. While your great-grandmother might have made pasta by hand or cooked the ragu for 8 hours, she probably had the time and the means to do it. Not all of us do have that time or means to do it. So while you're not necessarily changing a recipe, the difference between 4 hours and 6 hours of cooking isn't that huge. Slow cookers can do wonders for that kind of thing, as can air fryers, as I said before. Something I do that would abhor my ancestors, for example, is the way I cook haggis. Haggis is supposed to be boiled kind of for like 2 to 4 hours inside the skin thing that it comes in. I don't do that. I really don't do that. Also, usually because I'm only cooking it for 2 people, I take the haggis itself out of the thing, the kind of sack that it comes in, whatever that's made of. I don't really want to know, to be honest. And I pan fry it. Like I just take it out, break it all up, and just pan fry it until it's hot and, browned all the way through. Tastes exactly the same. And it takes 15 minutes instead of 2 to 4 hours. Might not be right or traditional, but tastes exactly the same. And, aside from convenience and budget, I would also say, for your own tastes. As I said, as long as you're not condoning something necessarily or selling it as like authentic and traditional, do whatever you like. Dip your cheddar cheese in vanilla yogurt. I'm not going to stop you. And that's all I really have to say on this today. I don't know whether we've broken any new ground. Probably not. But I hope you've maybe found your people here in the comments of others, or you've had your own thoughts expressed here without having to say them yourself. Thank you guys so much, as always, for sharing your opinions and your responses. You're always so funny and entertaining and insightful. And you've opened me up to think about things I haven't thought about necessarily. So thank you all so much for that. But that's all I really have time for today. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. Don't forget, if you'd like to, you can support the podcast and Maverick Baking and Sweet Nothings podcast in general on Patreon. You can just search Maverick Baking or Sweet Nothings podcast and it'll come up. For as little as $1 a month. You can get some exclusive access to recipes you won't find anywhere else, and also early access to every episode. And yeah, thank you as always, and I'll see you for the next one.